Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this short video we're going to discuss the most important updates that took place during the previous night of the local time. First we're going to start from Avdiivka direction because the most important updates are coming from this territory. Today the Ukrainian sources, to be more precise the forces of 53rd Mechanized Brigade, published the video how they were attacking the Russians in this area, which confirms that the Russians during the previous clashes in this area managed to establish control over this sector. The 53rd Mechanized Brigade located right exactly in this on the top of the Russian progress, and this brigade is responsible for the defense of this line. So if we take a look at the map, we're gonna see that during the previous days the Russians launched an offensive operation along the city of Vadiane. The Russians were moving along this road, and somewhere inside of this field the Russians were attacked by FPV drones. We don't, according to that video, we don't know the exact number of losses among the Russians, but as I understand the losses weren't so heavy, and according to that video, as I understand, the Russians were moving further to the north in direction of this tree line. So there are very high chances that as a result of clashes the Russians managed to establish control over this area. Furthermore, during the previous days we got updates that the Russians managed to develop their positions on the west of that tree line, so there are very high chances that the Russians had progress, and maybe today we're going to receive more geolocations from this area. Another important update are coming from Pervomaiska. On this video we can see the Ukrainian sabotage group or rotation group who was heading on the edge position of Pervomaiska. The Russians discovered the movements of Ukrainian forces, and they started bombardments and bombings of the Ukrainians with FPV drones, with artillery systems, with tall flamethrower systems. So we don't also know the exact number of losses among the Ukrainians. We can use this video for geolocation purposes to understand the current Ukrainian positions, and according to this video the Ukrainians were moving along Pervomaiska from the northwest. The Ukrainians were moving along the street. Somewhere in this area the Ukrainians were discovered by the Russians FPV drone, and they took a decision to hide somewhere in the shelter, and they entered this territory trying to hide from the Russian FPV drone strikes and artillery bombardments. So anyway, this area, as I understand, is under complete Ukrainian control. That was either sabotage group or maybe that was rotation group whose main purpose was to replace Ukrainian forces on these positions. Now we are moving to the central and south central part of Avdiivka. We don't have any geolocations, but we have like fire anomaly that confirms that the Russians also continue bombardments of this territory using all types of weapons they have. And the main purpose of these bombardments is that the Ukrainians have their positions very far from the mainland, from the main Avdiivka, and I'm talking about this defense belt that is under complete Ukrainian control. And to support these forces, the Ukrainians need to use these roads for these purposes, and the main Ukrainian reserves to support this part of Avdiivka fortifications are located in this area. So the Ukrainians use this territory, and that was the reason why the Russians were bombing this territory. They were trying to pin down the Ukrainians, to suppress them, and not to allow them to complete the normal rotation process on the, let's say, the Ukrainian fortification that located between Kamyanka and Krutaya Balkan. I'm talking about this area. Now we're moving to the northern Avdiivka direction, about the Terikon. We're going to talk about Terikon and chemical plant. The Russian sources published another video of a very heavy fire in the chemical plant. The Russians are bombing this territory 24 hours, 7 days a week, trying to destroy the Ukrainian main fortifications. Some sources are saying that the Russians have already launched offensive operation and managed to establish control over the few streets and buildings and shelters, fortifications in chemical plant. Yet we haven't received even a single geolocated confirmation. When talking about the southern part of Terikon, we got few pictures. Few mappers have already updated their map. For example, Syriac shows that the southern area is already under Russian control, and the Russian sources are showing the same picture, but the Russians also are adding that the Russians managed to cross the railways, and currently there are heavy clashes for the Ukrainian tree lines, so for the tree lines that located on the Ukrainian side of the railways. So according to all these updates, all these things, as I understand, currently this white cloud that I'm trying to mark is the main like area of clashes of Russian forces. So they're fighting for this territory, and if the Russians are able to establish control over these like 3 lines over the railway, of course the Ukrainian situation will get even worse in comparison with current situation. And it's all these geolocations, all these updates, of course, about the global scope of the battle for Avdiivka. But when talking about the local achievements, local operational like positions, currently the Russians have one important goal, one important target, and the target is to establish control over this 3 line. This is probably the most important line for now at this stage of storm of Avdiivka. And if the Russians are able to get this 3 line, the next phase is to establish control over this fortification, this one. So this is the global scope of, let's say, this week. If the Russians are able to capture this territory, then the Russians will be able to establish fire control and to establish any types of control over this like road that goes from Avdiivka to this residential area. And after that, the Russians will be able to start offensive operation in direction of this residential area, and as I understand that they will be able to take this territory very fast. So this is the main Russian focus, not on the chemical plants, not on the south, but from the northeast of Avdiivka agglomeration, of Avdiivka fortification, the territory that located below Terikon and below Vesele and below Krasnogorovka. This is the main focus of the Russian forces. Very interesting details and geolocation we got from the Ukrainian side. This is very fresh and recent geolocations. On this video we can see another episode of Russian offensive operation against the Ukrainian positions. On this video we can see how the Ukrainians were trying to slow down and to stop the Russians with all types of weapons they have. They were bombing the Russians heavily with FPV drones, with cluster rounds. A lot of cluster rounds were reused during the Russian attacks. The Ukrainians were bombing the Russians with just artillery strike. And on this video we see the railways. So as you can see, and probably this is the first geolocated confirmation of the Russian presence along the railways. So the Ukrainian drone was flying above the railways, trying to spot and discover the Russian movements, the Russian troopers, and after that the Ukrainians were bombing the Russians with FPV drones and artillery. So this is the first evidence that the Russians do have control along the railways, and this is very important, interesting video. Also, the Ukrainians tried to show the level of losses among the Russians. A significant number of infantry were killed during that attack, but of course the level losses are very heavy, but we see that the Russians managed to achieve a significant result as a result of clashes on the northern part of Avdiivka. Furthermore, another important thing that the Russians don't have any problems, let's say, to storm Avdiivka when talking about equipment, when talking about the vehicles, tanks, ammo they have. The only problem the Russians have is to break and penetrate the first defense belt. And for these purposes, the Russians need to bring tall flamethrower systems. And for example, during the previous day, the Russians tried to get on the combat line another tall flamethrower system to ease the Russian progress and the Russian movement. But the Ukrainians also understand, as soon as the Russians are able to get tall flamethrower systems to the combat line, we can start counting days before the entire Avdiivka go into fall. So that's why they pay like personal attention to this type of weapon. And on this video we see how the Russians almost got tall flamethrower system to the combat line, but as a result of FPV drone strike that machine was destroyed, and after that there were very heavy explosions. So this is the main reason why the Russians are still slow. For example, when talking about this residential area, nothing can survive. I will add this icon cloud on map. Nothing can survive as a result of tall flamethrower strike, no matter the fortifications and no matter the the shelters and the level on the ground. Everything will be destroyed. But the problem that first you need to get this system on the combat line. When talking about other direction, another important update, let's finish with Donetsk. The Russians today published the first photo of the newest Russian cruise missile with nuclear power engine, Burevestnik. This is the rocket missile that can fly above, like in the sky, for a very long period of time to control the situation. So very interesting update, and this is the weapon of, let's say, of 0 day, or how to sell this situation. This is the game changer that can. This is not the game changer. This is the most important security aspect of Russian Federation. This type of weapon can destroy anything in this world and can penetrate any air defense in the world as well. Some details are continue coming from Bakhmut direction. The Ukrainians activated their clashes in this area. They published significant number of videos with FPV drone strikes against the Russian positions. So we know the Ukrainian pattern, and every time the Ukrainian want to start some clashes or another offensive operation, first of all they try to pin down and try to clear the territory with FPV drones. So now we see that how the Ukrainians try to destroy the Russian forces along the railways, and probably they managed to achieve. And also the Ukrainians destroyed few armored vehicles inside the Bakhmut in the vicinity of Vilshany, Zaitseva, also with the usage of the same type of weapon, FPV drones. We know that Ukrainians have established a small foothold on the Russian side of the railways in the vicinity of Avdiivka, so I expect this week also some attempts from the Ukrainian side to attack. Very interesting update is coming from Kiev, the capital of Ukraine. According to some sources, Zelensky is planning to dismiss Zaluzhny, and the main reason of that Zaluzhny haven't managed to achieve any results during the Ukrainian counter-offensive operation in Zhaporzia. In Vremivka, this is like official position, official version why the Zelensky wants to dismiss Zaluzhny, but some sources are saying that Zelensky wants to dismiss Zaluzhny because Zelensky needs to make president elections the next year, and Zaluzhny might be like a candidate for this position, and of course there are very high chances that Zelensky would lose the battle with Zaluzhny for president chair in Ukraine. And that's it for this short video. Military Summer channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye. Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 30th of October of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with Kupiansk direction. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost 9 soldiers wounded and killed, and 7 armored vehicles including 2 tanks. During the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians launched a very powerful offensive operation, including significant number of armored vehicles. And basically the Ukrainians were moving from Petropavlovka, they got on the road, and they were moving along the road, trying not to discover and not to show the minefields. They were trying to move in direction of Orlyanka, trying to attack the Russians from the top, from the north, and to attack the Russian flanks in this area. The Russians managed, as you remember, establish a foothold on the west of this road. For that attack, the Ukrainians, as I told you, were using significant number of armored vehicles. During that movement, the Ukrainians were attacking the Russian positions on the north because the movement was very risky. The Ukrainians were moving very close to the main Russian positions, but all these things, all these tactics didn't help the Ukrainians to complete the operation successfully. During that attack, the Ukrainians lost every single tank that was involved in that operation. For example, on this video you can see, according to information we have, the T-64 tank, and as a result of counter anti-tank missile, the tank first was damaged, and after that the tank was destroyed. As you can see, there is a secondary detonation. We see that Ukrainian tank drivers started running away from this area. That was not the only tank. Behind that tank there were 2 more tanks heading in the same direction, and on this video we can see 2 Leopards heading in direction of Orlyanka. We got the same story on this direction as well. The Russians were bombing and attacking this territory, and mainly the Russians were using anti-tank missiles. And as a result of another strike, the Ukrainians lost Leopard. The Leopard wasn't destroyed as a result of one strike. The Leopard was damaged, and the Ukrainian tank drivers also managed to survive and to run away. Another tank, as soon as the Ukrainians realized that the entire operation failed, he turned back and started running away. But the Russians are saying that he couldn't run very far, he was destroyed as well. So that was another operation of the Ukrainian forces, another counter-offensive operation of the Ukrainians in the vicinity of Orlyanka, in the square between Stepovo, Novoselka, Kislovka, Kotlarovka, Ivanovka, Yegidna, Orlyanka. So one more time, there are very heavy clashes in this area. As now we can have 100% proofs that the Russians managed to dig in deeper in this area. They have prepared the foothold for further offensive operation. Maybe the Ukrainians will make more attempts to counterattack, and if another counterattack will be defeated, the Russians will continue their encirclement operation in direction of Stepovo, Novoselka, trying to penetrate the Ukrainian defense belts from the north. Now we're moving to Liman front line. We got some details, some updates from this area. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost 70 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles. During the previous 24 hours, the main clashes took place in Kremenная forest. The Russian sources published a video of a storming operation, how the Russian special unit Akhmat, under support and cover of Russian artillery forces, were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions and basically storming them. And according to this video, as a result of offensive operation, the Akhmat special unit managed to clear this territory and to capture another Ukrainian stronghold. The most important thing that we need to understand about this territory is that these strongholds change its owner for almost every single week, twice a week or something like this. So nothing special. We need to wait more, because when talking about Kremenная, the front line in this area is static, and the main purpose of both sides, either the Russians and the Ukrainians, is to reduce each other's manpower as much as possible. There is no need to capture strongholds because it's too difficult, but to reduce the manpower is the thing that both sides can do in this direction. We haven't received anything from Sivers, but we have a lot of very interesting geolocations and videos from Bakhmut. After a very short operational pause in this area, the Ukrainians managed to regroup in this direction, and they started more attempts to attack the Russian positions. The main clashes took place along the railways between Bakhmut, Artyomovsk, and Andreevka, Kurdyumovka, Zaryanovka. The Ukrainians all over the entire railways tried to cross this area and to establish the foothold on the Russian side of the railways. And according to geolocations and according to all these videos, as I understand, the Ukrainians were pretty successful. They managed to force the Russians to step back further from the railways. The Ukrainians managed to create a foothold along entire railways from Artyomovsk, let's say from the north of Klishchiivka to Kurdyumovka, Zaryanovka. No matter the losses, as you can see, the Russians were bombing the Ukrainians heavily, but all these bombardments lead to some losses from the Ukrainian side, but these bombardments didn't force the Ukrainians to step back. So everything clear with northern Klishchiivka direction, but very interesting details are coming from Andreevka area. As you can see, the map has been updated. I believe that we can even move now Andreevka under complete Russian-Ukrainian control, because now this area is obviously under the Ukrainians and they do have some foothold on that side of the railways. And the Russians, we remember that there were a lot of geolocations, and the Russians took a decision to counterattack in this area, and the Russians collected some forces in Zelenopolia, and they tried to send some reconnaissance team, or let's say some storming troops, to clear the Russian side of the railways. So that was the Russian plan. So they're trying to move from Zaryanovka to Andreevka and to clear the trenches, to clear the tree lines from the Ukrainian forces, who recently managed to cross the area and to dig a little bit deeper in this area. But something went wrong. The Ukrainian sources published a video how the Russian assault troopers got in ambush and basically were destroyed. The Russians managed to land the infantry, but they haven't even managed to send their vehicles back, as the Ukrainians started bombing and shelling the Russians with mortar systems, with artillery, and as a result of those bombardments, significant number of Russian forces probably were wounded, even killed. So the Russians haven't managed to clear this territory, and the Ukrainians, as a result of those operations, managed to dig in deeper and to prepare a stronger foothold in this area. And currently they are ready to continue offensive operation further, basically to develop the foothold to the south, obviously further to the west, and of course to the north. So we're gonna follow this situation, because this foothold is getting more and more interesting. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes on entire Donetsk direction, the Ukrainians lost 285 soldiers, 5 armored vehicles, and 3 artillery systems. The level of losses is not so big, but much bigger in comparison with the 2 days before. Yesterday, the Ukrainians lost just 110 soldiers, and the day before yesterday, 160. So almost in 2 or 3 times losses became more. Now we're talking about Avdiivka area. We have a lot of geolocations, but we don't have a lot of videos. The interesting things that we can mention is that Ukrainians have redeployed Leopards in this area. Also, this video says that this is the Leopard that goes somewhere in Avdiivka. The only thing that we can use for geolocation is the, say, railway infrastructure. This is like railway things that goes along the railways. So I have added this icon softly that the Ukrainian Leopard was moving somewhere, let's say, along the railways, heading next to Krasnogorovka. So something like this. From the other side, we got almost the same video from the Russian side. The Russians were using Terminators, and the Russians are using Terminator massively on exactly on Avdiivka frontline. Currently, the sources are saying that this is the most, not powerful, but the most strongest armored vehicle in the special military operation. You need to spend a lot of time if you want to destroy this machine. The Russians are feeling themselves pretty safe and pretty secure. This machine has like machine gun, obviously, and this tank, this armored vehicle, of course, has also anti-tank missiles. So if you ask my opinion, I would say that if Leopard will start fighting with Terminator, there are very high chances that Terminator will destroy Leopard easily because of like anti-tank missiles on board. So the Russians and the Ukrainians, as you can see, are trying to use the most effective, the most powerful, the strongest type of armored vehicles they have, and they're going to be very heavy clashes, obviously. As we discussed in the previous videos, the Russians, as a result of clashes, managed to enter Severna from the south. At least some buildings were captured. Maybe the Ukrainians have already counterattacked and forced the Russians to step back. The Russians managed to capture more tree lines in the fields between Tonenka, Severna, Lastочkina, Avdiivka, Vadiana, and the Russians currently have some progress on the line between Chirikon and Krutaya Balka. The sources are saying that the Russians currently are moving or try to develop and to get their forces closer to Avdiivka itself, and for these purposes the Russians currently are trying to establish control over the fields, tree lines that located between the Russian territory and Avdiivka itself. So the next phase of Avdiivka news operation is the battles for these fields and for these tree lines. The Russians are trying to get as close as possible to the Ukrainians and to be on the distance of let's say mortar, like infantry mortar strike. They need to be very close to the city, to this industrial area. The Ukrainians also from their side try to slow down the Russians, and they're doing this job also pretty well. The Ukrainians published a lot of videos of FPV drones bombardments. As you can see, the Ukrainians, sometimes I have a feeling that Ukrainians don't have artillery systems at all. They have HIMARs and they have FPV drones. I don't remember the geolocations and the videos of the usage by the Ukrainians of, let's say, M777 howitzers. If I see M77 howitzer somewhere in geolocation, that means that the Russians managed to discover another howitzer and to destroy this howitzer with Lancet or FPV drone strike. I haven't seen howitzer, Ukraine howitzer in the work, so like if I see, that means that this howitzer is already destroyed or is going to be destroyed in a few seconds, because Lancet is flying against this type of weapon. The Ukrainians understand the risk and the situation of Avdiivka, so that's why they try to control this territory. And as I told you, the Ukrainians have redeployed the most powerful, strongest forces in this area, the most modern Western vehicles, tanks, armored vehicles. The Russians are doing the same, so the battle for Avdiivka is going to be very bloody and very heavy, but not so long as many experts are saying, probably 3-4 months, and that's it. Now we are moving to South Donetsk direction. We continue receiving very interesting details from Novomikhailivka. As I told you, my favorite front line. I expect that this is going to be a key region for the Russians in this area, and the entire situation in Ukraine depends on this small village. For some reason I have a third feeling or something like this. And the Ukrainians today published the video how the Russians were clearing this territory with tanks, with demining equipment. On this video we see the Russian convoy with infantry and Russian tanks heading from the south in direction of Novomikhailivka. We see how the Ukrainians were trying to bomb the Russians, how the Russians managed to land the infantry. Infantry started taking their positions along the road, trying to secure themselves against the Ukrainian artillery fire. Some vehicles continue moving further along the road in direction of Novomikhailivka. Some Russian armored vehicles turn to let's say to the left and start moving along the tree lines, trying to clear this territory from mines and to secure the passage for upcoming infantry and assault troopers. So basically this video has shown us the following. The Russians using the convoy were moving from the south in this direction. Somewhere in this area the Russians stopped. Some forces proceed moving further to the north. I don't think that they were planning to move very far, and some Russian tanks turned to the left or to the west and started moving along this tree line to the west, trying to clear this territory and to completely secure this area. So obviously the Russians' next goal goal is not to storm Novomikhailivka. Obviously, maybe some forces in this group are planning to do this, but currently the main important goal for the Russians is to establish control over this fortification area. And the Russians have completely prepared this foothold in front of this fortification. They have demined this area, and I believe that this week we are going to see some attempts from the Russian forces to storm this area. And if the Russians are able to do this, of course, the situation for the Ukrainians from the south of Novomikhailivka is going to get even worse than we have this right now. This will allow the Russians to, this will open the Russians possibilities to establish full 100% control over these territories, and this is in this foothold. If the Russians are able to capture this territory, will mean is enough for establishing full control of Novomikhailivka and basically the fall of Novomikhailivka. But of course, the Russians have some problems on the north. They still haven't managed to clear this territory completely. These forces are out of timing. They're not like doing everything according to schedule. They missed the deadlines, but as I understand, by the time the Russians capture the necessary footholds on the south, the Russian forces on the north also will complete their mission, and then we're going to see the storming of Novomikhailivka from two sides. I expect this operation to start this year. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes in this area, counter-artillery duels and so on, the Ukrainians lost 100 soldiers, 4 armored vehicles and 1 artillery system. On this video we can see the usage of new Russian Lancet with AI self-navigation. Now it doesn't matter the situation in this area, this target will be hit by the Russians because their AI self-navigation though. So the Russians, as you can see, continue improvement of their forces and they're bringing more and more modern weapons to the combat line. When talking about Avdiivka, we haven't received almost anything from this area. There are almost no clashes at all. Zhaporzia area develops also very interesting. We have a lot of geolocations, and the most important that Ukrainians continue their offensive operation on the west of Robotyne, trying to maintain their positions, and probably as a result of Ukraine offensive operation, they managed to capture another tree line on the west of Robotyne, and they got one tree line closer to Kopony and Rivne. So I'm trying to say that as a result of offensive operation, as I understand, the Ukrainians established control over this another yellow cloud. So what is the purpose of this attack, we may ask, and another evidence of that progress is that the Russians published the video how they were bombing this territory with multi-launch rocket systems. These fields were under very heavy fire, and the Russians tried to stop the Ukrainians, not to allow them to bring more reserves and so on. So what were the purposes of all these attacks? Another video. And the thing is that currently, if we will zoom out from this territory, we're going to see that Ukrainians prepared a very long foothold, a very, let's say, long front line, and not just to attack Kopony or to continue further to Solotka Balka or Novoprokopovka. During the previous months, the Ukrainians had few areas of their main activity. And these are the, let's say, Robotyne itself and this area between Kopony and Novodanilovka, and the second area Novoandreevka, Sherbaki, Nistyryanka. So 3 areas of concentration of Ukrainian forces. Let's reduce the number of updates. So basically the Ukrainians during the previous months managed to create, to concentrate their forces of different types, of different brigades, different like specializations and so on. They managed to concentrate their forces along this yellow line. So as you can see, this is a very long yellow line. They managed to stretch their forces. They managed to concentrate significant number of forces, the last of their reserves. And as I understand, the Ukrainians currently are planning to start broad frontline attacks against lots of cities. The Ukrainians will attack Mirne, the Ukrainians will attack Nistyryanka, the Ukrainians will attack between Nistyryanka and Kopony, the Ukrainians will attack Kopony from the north, the Ukrainians will try to attack Kopony in the central part, the Ukrainians will try to attack Kopony from the south, and of course the Ukrainians will try to attack Kopony between, let's say, Kopony, Rivne and Novoprokopovka. And this is the broad frontline attack. This is going to be the final attack of the Ukrainians this year. The Russians obviously also control the situation. They see everything, but the question is is not whether the Russians can see this or not. The question is whether the Russians are ready and they can repel this attack and defeat the Ukrainians one more time. Because if the Ukrainians can achieve some results, obviously they're not going to continue their offensive operation further to, let's say, Takmak, because they don't have this time. But by taking Nistirianka Kopony, the Ukrainians will be able to create a very strong foothold for the next year. And the next year they will have a foothold and the bridgehead and the base to start everything from the beginning. Because if the Ukrainians are defeated, they will lose Rabotina by the end of this year. At least as I understand this situation exactly like this. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes on this area, the Ukrainians lost 220 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles, 2 tanks including 1 Leopard, and 4 artillery systems. So basically the level of losses of the Ukrainians for the previous 24 hours is on the same level as the Ukrainian losses we saw in June and July during the most active phase of Ukraine's greatest counteroffensive operation. So currently, let's say, today is the same losses as the Ukrainians had, let's say, on the 4th of June. Of course, much less armored vehicles were destroyed, but when talking about the manpower, almost the same level. So something big is happening right now, but we are not getting a lot of updates, just the Ministry of Defense report and few geolocations. Now we're moving to Kherson direction. New commander of tactical group Dnipro of Russian Federation tried to fix the issues and the problems that were created by the previous commander in this area. The Russians are bombing the Dnipro Islands and the area between Krinky and the Ukrainian positions heavily with all types of weapons the Russians have. But the Ukrainians also realize that they have chances and that they need to increase the pressure. The Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours tried to suppress and destroy the Russian armored vehicles on the Russian bank of the river with FPV drones. They have destroyed significant number of tanks, or at least damaged them. And currently, as you can see, according to the focus of Ukrainian FPV drones, the Ukrainians are planning to open third or maybe fourth foothold on the Russian bank of the river, and this is going to be the village by the name of Korsunki. So at least they have already started the preparation using FPV drones. So at least all these evidence, all these things reminds me some Ukrainian pattern, and the next step of this pattern is another landing operation with attempt to capture this territory. And if the Russians lose this bridgehead also, this is going to be a disaster, to tell the truth, but let's see, let's follow what is going to be next. The Russians continue destroying the Ukrainian forces on the south of Pridniprovska. We also have the video of fire anomalies, all these territories under very heavy fire. The Russians use all type of weapon they have to destroy the Ukrainians and not to allow them to concentrate the critical mass before the next wave of attack. So we'll see what is going to be next. The Russians reported that as a result of clashes on Kherson direction, the Ukrainians lost 70 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles and 3 artillery systems. The level of losses is heavy. Obviously, it's not like 20 or 30 soldiers as in the regular day. It's 70 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles and a lot of artillery systems. The Russians managed to discover also a very big ammo depot somewhere like in the Ukrainian rear, and as a result of Tornado S strike, that ammo depot was destroyed. Now we are moving to Odessa. The Russians published the video how they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions with Onyx missiles. As a result of those strikes, they managed to destroy the fire position of Ukrainian missiles because, as you know, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians launched a full-scale missile offensive rocket operation using significant number of different types of missiles, drones against Crimea, trying to penetrate the Russians' defense belt. But the Ukrainians were completely defeated and not even a single missile managed to penetrate the Russian air defense. And today, for the first time since the beginning of the special military operation, I got the feeling that the Russians managed to establish complete air defense superiority above Crimea. And from now on, the Ukrainians don't have even a single chance to penetrate the Russians' air defense belt. Just if they are if they wake up one day and they wake up at a lucky day and the Russians wake up at unlucky day, maybe only this day, the Ukrainians have some chances to penetrate the Russians. The Ukrainians try to use different types of missiles. They try to combine. If you remember a few days ago, they tried to stress and to test and overload these air defense with drones. Around 40 drones the Ukrainians used for those purposes. All of them were shot down or were destroyed with electronic warfare, and after that Ukrainians managed to discover the Russian air defense positions, and now they tried to launch a very powerful attack. The Russians destroyed Storm Shadow missiles, the Russians destroyed attacks missiles, a lot of drones and so on. Furthermore, the Ukrainians do have problems with aircrafts because a lot of aircrafts were destroyed since the beginning of this month because of new Russian missile R-37M, and also the Russians are saying that Ukrainians managed to upgrade their Su-27 aircrafts for launching Storm Shadows, because even a half a year ago the Ukrainians have just Su-24 who were able to attack the Russians with Storm Shadow, but now they have increased the types of aircrafts that can carry this type of missile. Obviously the Ukrainians will continue improvements of their forces. The question is whether it's going to help them or they have wasted their time. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for your watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.